Chapter 5 Lone Star, Illinois. Being elected to Congress, though I am very grateful to our friends for having done it, has not pleased me as much as expected. Lincoln wrote the speech several weeks after his victory over Pete Cartwright. As the only Whig representative from Illinois, he knew that he could have very little influence on the Democratic administration of President Polk. He hoped, however, to offer constructive leadership in his own party, which, despite its narrow majority in the House of Representatives, was foundering. Its most prominent national leaders, like Harry Clay and Daniel Webster, still yearned for another chance at the presidency, but they were clearly over the hill. Equally out of date were many of the traditional Whig issues like a national bank, federal support of internal improvements, and a protective tariff. Lincoln saw his 2 years in Congress as an opportunity to help the Whig Party find fresh leadership and adopt a program relevant to the times. He devoted himself to promoting the presidential prospects of General Zachariah Tyler and to developing a new Whig ideology. In the first go, he was successful, but he failed in the second. At the end of his term, he left Washington disappointed, not so much with his own performance as with that of the political party to which he belonged. 1. The Lincolns arrived in Washington December 2nd, 1847, just a few days before the 13th Congress convened. They went to Brown's Hotel. Presently, they removed to the boarding house Mr. N.G. Spring, where both Stuart and Baker had resided when they were in Congress. It was just east of the Capitol, in a row of houses on land now occupied by the Library of Congress. 8 other congressmen or Whigs boarded with Miss Spring, the most notable of whom was Joshua R. Giddings of Ohio, a stalwart and uncompromising enemy of slavery. Lincoln immediately made himself at home in the boarding house, charmed the other guests with his jokes and anecdotes. One of the fellow boarders, Dr. Samuel Boothby, recalled when there was a controversy over political issues, or especially over the subject of slavery, Lincoln would interrupt it by interposing some anecdote, thus diverting it into a hearty and general laugh, and so completely disarranged the tenor of the discussion. For recreation, Lincoln joined other members of the mass in bowling at the nearby alley owned by James Casparis. He was a very awkward bowler, Dr. Boothby remembered, but played the game with great zest and spirit, just solely for exercise and amusement. He punctuated his bowling by telling stories, some of which were very broad, and the crowd of listeners always gathered when he was playing. Initially, both Lincolns found life in the national capital an exciting adventure. Washington, with its 40,000 inhabitants, including 2,000 slaves and 8,000 free blacks, was the largest, most cosmopolitan place either of them had ever known. The Capitol building, which you could see from Miss Spring's windows, was an imposing, so still unfinished structure. Oh, it was under construction, am I right? So, yeah. Temporary wooden dome suggesting the fragility of the Federal Union, and the opposite end of Pennsylvania Avenue loomed the White House, certainly the grandest residence ever either of the Lincolns had seen. South of Executive Mansion, preparations were underway for the laying of the cornerstone of the once obelisk of the Washington Monument. As Congressman Lincoln took part in the dedication ceremonies, most of the streets in the Capitol were still unpaved, but a cobblestone stretch of Pennsylvania offered a tempting array of specialty shops with luxury goods. And transients, the Lincolns, like other congressional families, were not admitted to the exclusive social life of long-term Capitol residents, but they could always find amusements. There were levees and the White House, though these were not heavily attended, since the parks forbade dancing and offering guests neither food nor drink, and there were bi-weekly concerts by the Marine Band in the president's grounds. In the evenings, there were sometimes lectures, concerts. On one notable occasion, Lincoln attended a performance by the Ethiopian serenaders, minstrels in blackface who had recently sung for Queen Victoria and the royal family. But Mary soon became dissatisfied. Her husband, busy with the work of Congress, had little time to spend with her. Indeed, he wrote later he thought she hindered me some in attending to business. She lacked female companionship because a few of the congressmen were accompanied by their wives. The four Lincolns lived in a single large room, and she appeared downstairs only at the meal times. Because the Lincoln children were noisy and undisciplined, there was inevitably friction with the other boarders. Robert, one of them, remembered, was a bright boy who seemed to have his own way. Eddie was sick most of the time. In the spring, Mary Lincoln decided to take the children back to Lexington, Kentucky, where she stayed with her father. When Lincoln wrote her, he ended sometimes tense relations and Miss Springs. All the halls, or rather all with whom you were on decided good terms, sent it aloud to you. The others seemed okay. That's crazy. That's funny, Lincoln. Okay. It's always how we to express the things. That's just funny. Lincoln was so absorbed in congressional duties that at first he hardly missed her. Enthusiastically, he threw himself into the work of the House, establishing a conspicuous record for faithful attendance for the 456 roll call votes during his 2 years of service. He missed only 13. Appropriately, in view of his experience as postmaster, he was assigned to the Committee on Post Offices and Post Roads. He also served on the Committee on Expenditures in the War Department. In both committees, he did his share of the work and effectively presented reports from the Post Office Committee to the House. He regularly and promptly submitted petitions from his constituents, most of whom dealt with requests for land grants for constructing railroads. He did his best to help his friends who sought appointments from the federal government, even though he knew that there was little reason to think a Democratic administration would shower patronage on a fresh Whig congressman. Much of his time was spent in answering his correspondence without, of course, the aid of a secretary or assistant. After he began making speeches in the House of Representatives, he took great pains to see that they reached his home audience, purchasing no fewer than 7,580 copies, which he painstakingly addressed and franked in his own hand, far more than most of the other members of the Congress. The House of Representatives did not overawe him. If he was new to Washington, so were 200 of the other representatives in the 13th Congress, and his 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature, and made him familiar with parliamentary procedures like any other freshman congressman, and the little stage fright when he first gained the floor to make a few remarks, but he got over quickly. I find speaking here and elsewhere about the same thing. Reported Herbert was about as badly scared and no worse as I was when I speak in court. Quickly began to take the measure of his fellow representatives, unlike the Senate, where his old rival Stephen A. Douglas now joined such august salons like Webster, John C. Calhoun, and Thomas Hart Benton.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The House, for the most part, was composed of men of mediocre ability and unlocal reputation. The one great exception was John Quincy Adams, distinguished alike for his rock-like integrity, his implacable hatred for slavery. But the former president died early in the session before Lincoln really got to know him. Apart from Giddings, whose President Lincoln felt more as a moral than a political force, he was most taken by Georgia Whig Alexander H. Stephens, whom he described as a little slim, pale-faced, consumptive man. The young Southerner, like Lincoln, was looking for way to rejuvenate and reunite the party. Looking about the whole, Lincoln could readily identify a number of other industrious and competent representative men like David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, author of the celebrated proviso that would bar slavery from all territory again in the Mexican War. Clem B. Smith, the astute Indiana political manager who would become Lincoln's first Secretary of the Interior, and Robert C. Schenck of Ohio, whom Lincoln would one day appoint a major general in the army. Not a modest man, Lincoln saw no reason to feel that these flickering lights outshined him. He found his party in disarray. Although weak and downwardly were well in the off-year elections of 1846, party leaders were troubled by the outlook from the 1848 presidential election. The Democratic administration of James K. Polk had been extraordinarily successful. The president settled the festering boundary dispute with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory by signing the Walker Tariff, which imposed were low duties. He set a policy for the next decade by firming vetoing an internal improvements bill. He killed that question as a political issue, and he presided over a highly successful war that was about to end California and New Mexico to the Union. Whigs recognized that it would be very difficult to defeat the Democrat most often mentioned as Polk's probable successor, Senator Louis Cass of Michigan, whose contradictory positions on the Wilmot proviso allowed all factions to favor him. The only issue on which the Democrats appeared to be vulnerable was the president's role in originating the Mexican War. This was not the subject to which Lincoln hitherto had given much attention. Like every other American, he knew about the Texas revolt from Mexico in 1836, and because he thought of the Mexicans and greasers, okay, he no doubt was pleased when Texas gained its independence. But in 1844, when President John Tyler urged the annexation of Texas to the United States, Lincoln, like Henry Clay, from President Van Buren to Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, branded the move as altogether inexpedient. He did not share Tyler's enthusiasm for territory expansion, because he later declared He did not believe in enlarging our field, but in keeping our fences where they are and cultivating our present possession, making it a garden, improving the morals and education of the people. Nothing to say when Texas was annexed and when President Polk possessed aggressively to protect the new territory and also to settle long-standing claims, the complaints against Mexico. In April 1846, fighting broke out between the Mexican army and American troops commanded by Zachariah Taylor in territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, a region claimed by both the United States and Mexico. The United States declared war. Unpopular in New England, the conflict stirred patriotic enthusiasm in other parts of the country, and in Illinois there was a rush to enlist in the voluntary army. Both Harding and Baker, Lincoln's predecessors, became officers. But the Mexican War never surfaced as issue in the congressional campaign that Lincoln and Peter Cartwright were waging. Lincoln's only utterance on the subject was a warm, thrilling, and effective speech that he gave on May 30th in a public meeting to encourage volunteering. Even after he was elected to Congress, he made no comment on the war, believing, as he said later, that all those who, because of knowing too little or because of knowing too much, could not conscientiously approve the conduct of the president in the beginning of it, should the good citizens and patriots remain silent at least till the war should be ended. By the time Lincoln arrived in Washington, felt free to speak out because the fighting was substantially over. In hard-fought battles and Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, Monteria, and Buena Vista, General Taylor repeatedly routed the Mexican forces north, while General Winfield Scott led an expedition that captured Veracruz and eventually Mexico City itself. Can you believe that? Okay, they did that, huh? Mexico City is the capital city of Mexico, so yeah. In the annual message of December 1847, President Polk asked Congress for additional funds to bring the war to a close, claiming the vast territories of New Mexico and California as a partial indemnity. With a notable triumph, he announced that he was about to conclude the war. The Mexico had initiated by invading the territory of the state of Texas, striking the first blow and shedding the blood of our citizens on our own soil. The message was for the pretext for a sustained weak attack upon the president, his administration, and in general the Democratic Party. Lincoln led the assault on Polk. In December the 22nd, introduced a series of resolutions requiring the president to provide the House with all the facts which go to establish whether the particular spot of soil on which the blood of our citizens was so shed was or was not our own soil. In the manner of prosecuting attorney, he demanded that the president inform Congress whether that spot has ever been part of Texas, and whether its inhabitants has ever submitted themselves to the government or law of Texas by consent or by compulsion, either by accepting office or voting in elections or paying taxes or serving on juries or in any other way. Lincoln clearly intended to show that the American army had begun the war by making an unprovoked attack on the Mexican settlement, despite the fact that General Taylor had more than once intimated to the War Department that no such movement was necessary to the defense of protecting Texas. The attack became more general on January 3rd when Representative George Ashmun of Massachusetts introduced a resolution declaring that the war had been unnecessary and unconstitutional begun by the President of the United States. It was adopted by the votes of 85 weak representatives, including Lincoln's. A few days later, Lincoln continued the campaign against Polk in a long speech on which he had worked very hard, subjecting Polk's version of the origins of the war to a close, lawyerly scrutiny. He chided the president for the gaps in his evidence and his logic. The mistake could not be unintentional because Miss Polk is too good a lawyer not to know what is wrong. After shifting the whole of the president's evidence, he demanded that Polk respond to the interrogatories he had posed. Let him answer fully, fairly, and candidly. Let him answer with facts and not with arguments. Piously professed that if the president couldn't do so, then I'm with him for his justification. But if he failed to respond, that would show that he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him. The President Lincoln speculated with freedom that he would never have permitted himself in a courtroom must have begun a war motivated by a desire for military glory, that attractive rainbow arises in showers of blood, that a serpent's eye that it charms to destroy, that he filled his mind, tasks beyond his power began running hither and thither like an ant on a hot stove, and this bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man could not only speak in the half-insane mumbling of a fairy dream. Proud of his effort, Lincoln hoped he would establish his place in the House of Representatives. Now feeling very much at home, he began to think of Washington as a very pleasant place. And he regretted his place that he, like Harding and Baker before him, would serve only one term. When Herbert reported that some people thought he should be re-elected, he replied that his word and honor forbade him to enter the race, but he added coyly, if it should so happen that nobody else wishes to be elected, I could not refuse the people the right to send me again. That's interesting, huh? Yeah. Go ahead.
Part 2. His expectations were quickly dashed. In Washington, nobody paid much attention to his resolutions, which the House neither debated nor adopted, or to his speech. The President made no response to Lincoln's interrogatories. He never mentioned Lincoln's name, even in his voluminous diaries. Congressmen were for the most part equally indifferent, regarding Lincoln's attack as part of the general Whig assault upon a Democratic administration. One obscure Indiana Democrat did chide Lincoln for having failed to tell his constituents during his election campaign that he was opposed to the war. And the Representative John Jameson of Missouri professed to be astonished that the successor of John G. Hardin, killed at Buena Vista, and of E.D. Baker, a hero of the Battle of Cerro Gordo, should make such an unpatriotic speech. There was little newspaper comment. The Baltimore Patriot carried a squib commending his spot resolutions and commenting, Evidently, there is music in that very tall Mr. Lincoln. And the St. Louis, Missouri Republican.
Well, I don't understand saying, but that's funny, right? So, what that means? Do you know what it means? Okay, it's like.
I guess that's referring to the fact that he's trying to make his voice known within the House of Representatives.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
As a generally quiet man. I don't know.
I see. Yeah.
Let's see. Where was I?
At the St. Louis, Missouri.
And the St. Louis, Missouri Republican called his speech one of great power, replete with the strongest and most conclusive arguments. But none of the newspapers with national circulation paid attention to either Lincoln's resolutions or his address. Very different were the responses from Illinois. As was to be expected, Democratic newspapers were uniformly critical. In Springfield, the Illinois State Register contrasted Lincoln's opposition to the war with the gallantry and heroism of Hardin, who had rushed to enlist in the army. Later, the Register called Lincoln's speech politically motivated, predicted that his ideas would be repudiated by the great mass of people who voted for him, and warned that Lincoln would have a fearful account to settle with the veterans when they returned from Mexico. Other Democratic newspapers joined the attack. According to the Charleston, Illinois Globe, Lincoln's resolutions showed conclusively that the littleness of the pettifogging lawyer was not merged into the greatness of the statesman. And the Peoria Press denounced this miserable man of spots for his traitorous course in Congress.
It's interesting those time of the wording, right?
Yeah. Throughout the 7th District, public meetings, largely Democratic, though some were labeled nonpartisan, condemned Lincoln's course. The rally in Morgan County, where Hardin had lived, expressed deep mortification at Lincoln's base, dastardly, and treasonable assault upon President Polk, and prophesied that henceforth will this Benedict Arnold of our district be known here only as Ranchero Spotty of one term.
Seriously.
Really getting on to him. Condemnation from Democrats was to be expected and discounted, but Lincoln was troubled by the faintness of praise he received from fellow Whigs.
Yeah.
Simeon Francis's Illinois State Journal, formerly the Sangamo Journal, loyally supported him, as did B.F. James's Tazewell Whig. Some Whig newspapers reported that his crack speech had placed him in the front rank of the best speakers of the House, in the House. But most of the other editors imitated the Quincy Whig, which published Lincoln's resolutions with the mild comment that they were based upon facts which cannot be successfully controverted. Most disturbing were the private messages he received from his political friends in Illinois. Dr. Henry strongly dissented from the prevailing Whig view of the war. Of Illinois Whigs followed Henry Clay, and opposed all territorial annexations as a result of the war, he warned.
Henry Clay is one of the best orators in American history. So. Senator history. Go ahead.
Interesting.
Yeah.
They would continue to be the minority party for a long time. Soberly, he wrote Lincoln, "It would be painful in the extreme to part company with you after having fought with you side by side for so long." The Reverend John Mason Peck, a prominent Baptist of St. Clair County, sent a similar message, concluding that the government of the United States committed no aggression on Mexico. Herndon, too, reported that murmurs of dissatisfaction began to run through the Whig ranks. He deplored Lincoln's vote for the Ashmun Resolution, took it for granted that Lincoln's opposition to the war meant that he would not vote to supply the armies in the field, and warned that his partner's course would not be well received by the Whig men who have participated in the war. Herndon argued that instead of condemning President Polk for invading Mexico and starting a war on Mexican soil, Lincoln ought to follow the law of nations and argue that if it shall become necessary to repel invasion, the President may, without violation of the Constitution, cross the line and invade the territory of another country. Because Herndon claimed to speak for a considerable Whig constituency in Illinois, Lincoln went to some pains to refute his arguments. As for the Ashmun resolution, he replied, he had no choice. If he had opposed it, he would have voted a lie. Though he censured the President's conduct in beginning the war, he had every intention of voting for supplies to the armies. As for the attitude of returning Whig soldiers, he pointed out that veterans in Washington, with hardly an exception, did not hesitate to denounce as unjust the President's conduct in the beginning of the war. Lincoln dismissed Herndon's constitutional arguments. Allow the President to invade a neighboring nation whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion, and you allow him to make war at pleasure. Thus Herndon would place our President where kings have always stood. So that's really getting into the depth of like a undemocratic view, taking the President as being in the position of a king, which is exactly what the idea of America wanted to steer away from.
Sure.
As a position like the monarchy.
Yes.
The acerbity that crept into Lincoln's replies to Herndon reflected his discomfort that his partner, and whatever other Whigs he represented, had failed to understand the real intent of his attack on Polk. Now that the fighting was over and the peace treaty was expected in Washington momentarily, the only purpose that Lincoln and other Whigs had for assailing the President's course and beginning the war was political. Their object was to hurt the Democrats in the next presidential election. They were aware that this course entailed a considerable risk. Attacking the President's actions and beginning the war might easily be misunderstood as opposing the war itself. Whigs with a long memory knew how dangerous that position could be. When someone asked Justin Butterfield, a leading Chicago Whig, whether he would condemn the Mexican War as he once denounced the War of 1812, he responded, "No, indeed. I opposed one war, and it ruined me. From now on, I am for war, pestilence, and famine." But Lincoln, working closely with Alexander H. Stephens and the small group of other Whigs in the House who called themselves the Young Indians, thought he could resolve the difficulty. Whigs could assail the Democrats for having wrongly begun the war, and then demonstrate how loyally they supported their country's cause by nominating a general who was winning that war.
Man, this is a smart move.
Yeah. That general had to be Zachary Taylor.
Zachariah. Sorry.
That's Zachary. Zachariah ends with IAH.
I know, but the pronounced as a I. So.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, you can pronounce Y as I in certain names. So.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
That general had to be Zachariah Taylor, despite his total ignorance of public affairs and his lack of any political experience. Nobody knew where he stood on anything.
Cry, right? Cry, C-R-Y.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
So I guess it would be Zachariah?
Yeah.
Not
like
Zachariah.
Yeah, like Zachary. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, you don't see Cree.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So,
yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
That made him an available candidate, and Lincoln, eager to see new leadership in the Whig Party, jumped on the Taylor bandwagon. I am in favor of General Taylor as the Whig candidate for the presidency, he announced, because I am satisfied we can elect him, that he would give us a Whig administration, and that we cannot elect any other Whig. Our only chance is with Taylor, he explained. I go for him, not because I think he would make a better president than Clay, but because I think he would make a better one than Polk, or Cass, or Buchanan, or any such creatures, one of whom is sure to be elected if he is not.
Buchanan is considered as the worst president in American history. So.
Who?
Buchanan.
Oh, yeah?
Yes.
Interesting.
Go ahead.
Throughout the spring, Lincoln worked earnestly to secure Taylor's nomination, and in early June he attended the Whig National Convention at Philadelphia, where he attracted a good deal of attention as the only Whig representative from Illinois. After the convention nominated Taylor on the 4th ballot, Lincoln, along with 3 other members of the House, addressed a ratification meeting in Wilmington, Delaware. Introduced as the Lone Star of Illinois, he was received with 3 hearty cheers as he predicted a Whig victory in the fall. Taylor's nomination, he wrote Herndon, took the Democrats on the blind side by turning the war thunder against them. Grimly jubilant, he told his partner, "The war is now to them, the gallows of Haman, which they built for us, and on which they are doomed to be hanged themselves." Along with the other young Indians, Lincoln hoped not just to elect a presidential candidate, but to formulate a new set of beliefs for the Whig Party in place of old doctrines that no longer aroused public interest. Without some vital controlling principles, there was a danger that Whigs might follow local, sectional interests. In the South, some Whigs were tempted to make a defense of slavery their central issue, so that they could demonstrate that they, rather than Democrats, more truly represented their region's interests. In the Northeast, many Whigs, troubled by the huge influx of immigrants who tended to vote Democratic, flirted with the Native American Party. Other party leaders thought that a strong anti-slavery platform could win back the conscientious Whigs, mostly in New England, who were so opposed to any extension of slavery that they were ready to join anti-slavery Democrats in nominating ex-President Martin Van Buren on the new Free Soil ticket. All these approaches were tempting, and all would disastrously split the party. Even if Taylor was elected, he would find that he could not govern. To avoid these dangers, Lincoln urged Taylor to put himself above all local and regional issues. The proper Whig policy ought to be one of making presidential elections, and the legislation of the country distinct matters, so that the people can elect whom they please, and afterwards legislate just as they please, without any hindrance from the chief executive, save only so much as may guard against infractions of the Constitution, undue haste, and want of consideration. He wanted Taylor to announce, "Were I president, I would desire the legislation of the country to rest with Congress, uninfluenced by the executive in its origin or progress, and undisturbed by the veto unless in very special and clear cases." When Taylor made this pledge, Lincoln was jubilant, and he took the floor of the House of Representatives to explain what it meant. In substance, it is this. The people say to General Taylor, "If you are elected, shall we have a national bank?" He answers, "Your will, gentlemen, not mine." "What about the tariff? Say yourselves. Shall our rivers and harbors be improved? Just as you please." Even on the most divisive issues relating to slavery, Lincoln believed Taylor's position would be the same. Though Taylor was a Southerner and the owner of more than 200 slaves, he should declare that if Congress passed the Wilmot Proviso prohibiting the extension of slavery into the territories acquired from Mexico, he would not veto it. Lincoln did not explain that this contingency was highly unlikely, since no version of the Wilmot Proviso could pass the Senate, which was dominated by Southerners.
Okay.
This position, Lincoln maintained, was the best sort of principle for a party. The principle of allowing the people to do as they please with their own business.
Please continue.
Part 3. Lincoln's efforts to promote Taylor's election and to reformulate Whig ideology led him to advocate policies that would later come back to haunt him. His demand that President Polk prove that the United States owned the spot on which the first blood of the Mexican War was shed gave him the enduring sobriquet, Spotty Lincoln. Stephen A. Douglas repeatedly taunted him with it in their 1858 debates, and even during his presidency, it was used to question his patriotism. Equally embarrassing was Lincoln's argument that Polk acted unconstitutionally in ordering American troops into territory disputed with Mexico. He claimed that the Constitution gave the war-making power to Congress, not to the chief executive. The Founding Fathers, he told Herndon, had recognized that war was the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. This was the very argument that Lincoln's enemies used during the Civil War to combat with what they called his executive tyranny. They also invoked Lincoln's statement about the right of revolution, which he included as a curious digression in his speech attacking Polk. Forgetting his own advice that it is good policy to never plead what you need not, lest you oblige yourself to prove what you cannot. Lincoln argued that the title to the disputed land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande depended on depended on whether the inhabitants of that area had engaged in a revolution against Mexico. Any people anywhere have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. That's interesting. That's one of the foundational principles of the American government.
Yeah.
As mentioned, the natural rights of the people is right there in that sentence.
Okay.
Any portion of such people that may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit. This, he declared, is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope to believe is to liberate the world. These words he would have to eat in 1860, between 1860 and 1861.
When the South State withdraws.
Yeah. In another speech, Lincoln went out of his way to challenge Polk's argument that federal funding of internal improvements required an amendment to the Constitution. Lincoln opposed any change in that document. We would do much better to let it alone, he argued. Better.
Now, they had the civil rights, liberating the 14th Amendment because he amended the Constitution.
Yeah.
They amended it.
All right. Better habituate ourselves to think of it as unalterable. It can scarcely be made better than it is. It was a peculiar position for a future president whose name would always be connected with the 13th Amendment ending slavery.
Yeah.
That's funny. The argument that Lincoln advanced during the 1848 campaign that would have the most pernicious effect on his own administration was for a weak chief executive who would not veto measures passed by the Congress or dictate policies to his cabinet members. These were not new ideas for Whigs. The party had been founded to oppose that detestable, ignorant, reckless, vain, and malignant tyrant, Andrew Jackson, who made the entire government subject to one responsibility, one discretion, one will. But up to this time, Whigs had opposed a strong president largely because they objected to the policies he advocated. now with the nomination of General Taylor, they favored a weak chief executive to conceal the fact that their candidate stood for nothing. But Lincoln was convinced by his own arguments, and his preference for a do-nothing president persisted into the Civil War years, claiming that it was better that Congress should originate, as well as perfect its measures, without external bias. Lincoln, as president, exercised little influence over the legislative branch and used the veto power sparingly. On most issues, he followed Whig doctrine by giving his cabinet members such a free hand that at times it seemed that his administration had no policy at all.
Okay, I'm going to read the next portion. We finished that today. Okay, so
Okay.
the part 4. After working on his own mind the defense of Tyler and the reformulation of Whig principles, Lincoln was ready to go on the offensive against the Democrats. In July, the Tyler, Cairns, and Van Buren were all in the field. The House of Representatives virtually abandoned all pretense of doing business and listened to what were essentially stump speeches for the three candidates. When Lincoln gained the floor on July the 27th, he was the 8th congressman to speak on the presidential question, but fortunately for his hearers, he was able to leaven his arguments with humor. After paying perfunctory tribute to Tyler, he turned to ridiculing the Democrats for always campaigning in the name of Andrew Jackson. Like a horde of hungry ticks, you are stuck in the tail of the Herbert line to the end of his life, he jeered. And you're still sticking to it, enjoying the loathsome sustenance from it after he's dead. He poked fun at Kansas military record, comparing the general exploits in the War of 1812 with his own unheroic adventures in the Black Hawk War. Kansas changing positions on the Wilmot Proviso came in for a share for ridicule, and Lincoln gleefully described how the general as territorial governor and the Indian agent received pay in 7 different capacities simultaneously. During 1 8-month period, he asserted, Kansas drew 10 rations a day, Michigan 10 more, in Washington and the $5 worth more on the road between the two places. The Democratic candidates, he joked, would never suffer the fate of Balaam's ass, starving to death because it was unable to choose between 2 stacks of hay. Like of them would never happen to General Cass. Place the stacks 1,000 miles apart, he would stand still midway between them, and eat them both at once, and the green grass along the line would be apt to suffer some too at the same time. By all means, make him president, gentlemen, urged Democrat. He will feed you bounteously. If there is any left after he shall have helped himself. That's crazy. Sorry. It was a capital speech. The Baltimore American reported Lincoln's manner was so good-natured and his style so peculiar that it kept the horse in a continuous roll of merriment for the last half hour. Would commence upon his speech, follow up one of the aisles, and keep on talking, gesticulating, and walking until he would have found himself at the end of the paragraph down the center of the area in front of the clerk's desk. He would then go back and take another head and work down again. After Congress adjourned on August the 14th, Lincoln remained in Washington to work for Tyler's candidacy and triumph for Whig principles, helping with the Whig campaign newspaper, The Boundary. He oversaw the distribution of thousands campaign documents. He was not officially a member of the Whig Executive Committee for Congress, but sent up circular letters in his name, taking advantage of the acquaintances he had made while attending the Whig convention in Philadelphia. He kept close track of political developments in key states. For instance, asking William Stroller, the editor of the Boston Atlas, for his undisguised opinion as to what New England generally and Massachusetts particularly will do in the election. Similarly, requests nearly elected Representative Thaddeus Stevens and experienced sagacious Pennsylvania politician to report as to how the vote of the state, a down state for governor and president, is likely to go. Very busy during the hot Washington summer, Lincoln was also very lonely. When married, the children were in Washington. He hadn't found them in his way, but after they left, he began to miss them. I hate to stay in this old room by myself, he complained to the wife, finding that having nothing but business to notoriety and growing exceedingly tastily to me. Eagerly he read Mary's letter for news about the children, but when he asked him to find some stockings that would fit Eddie's dear little feet, he searched the capital in vain, finding not a single pair of the description gave, only one play parallel for any sort. He worried about the children, especially after he had what he called the foolish dream about dear Bobby. He wrote them little letters. Don't let the blessed fellows forget father. He enjoined his wife. They missed Mary most of all. His letter took her during this longest period of separation during the marriage. Combined the fatherly advice with mild sexual flirtatiousness. Are you entirely free from a headache? He asked. That is good, considering the first spring had been free from it since we were acquainted, the thing went on to end. I'm afraid you will get so well fed the young as to be want to marry again. She responded in kind with news of boys, her family, how much I wish instead of writing we were together this evening, she wrote. I feel very sad and weak from you. Presently he began to think of returning to Washington. Will you be a good girl in all things if I consent? Lincoln asked. Then come along, and that as soon as possible. Having got the idea in my head, I shall be impatient till I see you. By the time she was ready to travel, Lincoln was living on a campaign tour for New England. The married children joined him, found that she was for sightseeing. She probably got little pleasure out of the trip because Eddie was sick. Suddenly her husband too busy to take much interest in historic landmarks, appearing without much advance notice, and Worcester in central Massachusetts on the day before the state Whig convention was assembled. Lincoln accepted the invitation to speak at the City Hall rally on September 12th, and he gave an address, and he repeated with minor variations in Boston, Bedford, Lowell, Dedham, Taunton, and other places where he had appointments. Essentially the same speech had given in Congress in July, defending Tyler and ridiculing Keynes, but he now spent more time attacking Van Buren and the Free Soilers, who threatened to cause Whigs their normal majority in the state. Taking for granted the strong ancillary convictions of his listener, he established his own credentials by reminding them that the people of Illinois agreed entirely with the people of Massachusetts on this subject, except members they did not keep so constantly thinking about it. Both Whigs and the Free Soilers, he said, agreed that slavery was an evil, but that we were not responsible for it and cannot affect it in the states of this union where we do not live. Both were opposed to the extension of slavery to the new territories. The only question then was which party could most effectively curb the expansion of slavery, since the Free Soilers, by taking the votes from Tyler, would contribute to the election of Keynes. He concluded that they were behind the Whigs in their advocacy of the freedom of the soil. As to the expected, weak papers like the Boston Daily Advertiser praised Lincoln's speech as showing a searching mind and a cool judgment. It was one of the best speeches ever heard in Worcester, reported the Boston Atlas. And what is the word? How to pronounce that word? Boston
Atlas.
Atlas. Okay. And the Boston Herald called Lincoln a tremendous voice for Tyler and Fillmore. Democratic papers generally ignore Lincoln's appearances and throw soil editors when they troubled to notice them at all. Snared, his remarks were rather witty. The truth and reason and argument were treated as out of the question, as unnecessary and not to be expected. The Norfolk Democrat found Lincoln's remark absolutely nonsense, and the Roxbury Gazette called his performance a melancholy display. Lincoln's manner attracted as much attention as the substance of his remarks. With enormous height, stout as listeners, they were puzzled that he began leaning himself up against the wall and talking in the plainest manner, in the most indifferent tone, and gradually fixing his footing, and getting command his limbs, losing his tongue, and firing up his thoughts until he got the entire possession himself in his audience. Some were charmed by the rapid flow of argument and anecdote, wit and wisdom, hymns and prophecies, platforms and syllogism. What is that word?
Syllogisms.
Syllogisms. What that even mean? I'm sorry.
I don't know.
While others deplored his awkward gesticulations, the ridiculous management of his voice, and the comical expression of his countenance. With Yankee terseness, when you Bedford man sum up his opinion, it was pretty sound, but not a tasteful speech. Lincoln made no lasting impression on Massachusetts voters, but he left New England with indelible memories. Years later in the White House, he could recall every detail of his visit, including a grand dinner, a superb dinner, and the former Governor Levi Lincoln given 2 weeks later in Worcester. Made such impression that he could name every guest at the table and the order in which they were seated. When it was a he said, "Am I here?" the president told the Massachusetts visitor, "to learn deportment in the most cultivated state in the Union." He departed feeling that he had done his part to elect Tyler. The family went home by Willowful Avenue, where Lincoln conferred with Thurlow-Wade, the New York boss, who introduced him to Milland Fillmore, the weak vice presidential candidate. Then they briefly visited Niagara Falls, which inspired Lincoln to momentary what's the word? Rhapsody? Rhapsody, what that means?
It's like a song.
Okay. Repeat again, sorry.
Rhapsody.
Niagara is strong.
You pronounce it Niagara.
I'm sorry. Niagara. What?
Niagara.
Niagara. I have a hard time with that one.
It's okay.
Niagara is strong. And fresh day. Never hesitate to stop to correct my pronunciation.
Oh, no problem.
Okay? Yeah. Niagara is strong in the fresh day as 10,000 years ago. The mammals and mastodon, now so long dead, then the fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify that they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara, the long, long time, never still for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested. And here his pen stopped, as recognized that it was not good at this sort of thing. Later, when Lincoln asked, when Harding asked him what reflections he had when he saw the falls, he remarked solemnly that he wondered where all that water came from.
After you read that.
That is a good question to ask. Yeah, I wonder where it came from myself.